the park hummed with the quiet rhythm of a late autumn afternoon. Golden light streamed through the thinning branches of oaks and maples, casting dappled patterns on the ground. A soft breeze carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the air had a crispness that hinted at winter's approach. Children laughed as they chased each other around the swings, their parents watching from nearby benches, while joggers moved steadily along the winding paths. It was a picture of peace and normalcy, but Ethan Reynolds couldn't shake the uneasy feeling prickling at the edge of his thoughts. From his spot on a bench near the duck pond, Ethan squinted across the park. She was still there, sitting on the stone bench beneath the sprawling oak tree. A middle-aged woman in a red baseball cap, the white letters boldly proclaiming MAGA. She held a worn paperback in one hand, her other resting casually on the bench beside her. She looked perfectly at ease, her posture relaxed, her attention fully on the book. Ethan frowned. Something about her felt off. It wasn't that she was doing anything wrong. She wasn't yelling or causing a scene. But that hat, that statement, it felt like a challenge in a town like theirs, a quiet suburb that prided itself on tolerance and progressiveness. To Ethan, it seemed out of place, almost provocative. His gaze lingered on her, and with each passing second, his discomfort grew. "She doesn't belong here," he muttered under his breath, though there was no one around to hear him. His fingers itched to take action, to do something. He glanced at his phone, hesitating. What would he even say? That a woman in a public park was sitting on a bench, reading? Still, the hat gnawed at him. "Make America Great Again." The slogan had become a flashpoint for so much of what Ethan despised. Division, intolerance, ignorance. It symbolized everything he believed was wrong with the country. And here she was, flaunting it like a badge of honor. His thoughts spiraled. What if she wasn't alone? What if others like her were planning some kind of protest or disruption? The park was a safe space for families. What if they were in danger? He'd seen enough news reports to justify his concern. Ethan tapped the 911 icon on his phone before he could talk himself out of it. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly unsure. Yeah. Hi. There's a woman here in the park. She's just sitting there, but she's wearing a red MAGA hat. It's making me and, some other people uncomfortable. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, is the individual acting aggressively or threatening anyone? Well, no, not yet. But you never know with these types. She could be armed or dangerous. The dispatcher's tone stayed neutral. We'll send an officer to check on the situation. Please stay where you are. Ethan ended the call and exhaled sharply, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. He looked back toward the woman who hadn't moved. She turned a page in her book, oblivious to the storm he'd just set in motion. But 30 to 15 minutes later, the wail of a siren broke through the park's tranquility. A black and white police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out. Officer Kim, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air, adjusted her belt as she scanned the park. Beside her, Officer Jones, a fresh-faced rookie, looked eager but uncertain. Ethan stood, waving them over. His heart raced, a mix of vindication and nervous anticipation. "She's over there," he said, pointing toward the oak tree. The officers followed his gesture, their eyes landing on the woman. For a moment, their expressions froze. Then, to Ethan's surprise, they exchanged a glance that looked suspiciously like amusement. "Thank you, sir," Officer Kim said curtly. "We'll handle it." As they approached the woman, Ethan lingered nearby, straining to hear. The woman looked up as the officers neared, her brow furrowing slightly. "Afternoon, Chief," Officer Kim said, her voice carefully neutral. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Chief?" The woman smiled faintly, closing her book. "Afternoon, Kim. Something I should know about?" "Just a misunderstanding, ma'am," Officer Kim replied. The woman's gaze shifted past them, landing directly on Ethan. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, yet surprisingly kind. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. She stood, tucking the book under her arm. She wasn't tall, but there was an air of authority about her that made her seem larger than life. The red hat still perched on her head suddenly seemed less like a statement and more like an afterthought. "Misunderstanding, huh?" she said, her tone light but firm. "Let's clear it up then." The officers stepped aside as she approached Ethan, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with a mix of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite place. "Pity? Amusement?" Ethan stammered. I didn't know—" "I'm Sarah Whitfield," she said, cutting him off gently. "Police chief. And you are?" He swallowed hard. "Ethan Reynolds." "Nice to meet you, Ethan." She tilted her head slightly. "You called the police on me." "I didn't know," he blurted out. "I just saw the hat, and I thought—" She waited, her silence urging him to continue. "I thought you might be a threat," he finished weakly, his face burning with shame. Her expression softened, though her gaze remained steady. "You thought wrong." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of his mistake settling between them. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried no malice. "Ethan, how about we talk?" she said, gesturing toward a nearby bench. "No uniforms, no assumptions. Just two people having a conversation." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. As they sat down, the late afternoon light casting long shadows over the park, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment his life might change. And deep down, he hoped it would. The low rumble of idling engines filled the air as another police cruiser arrived at the park. By now, the earlier tranquility had given way to curious murmurs. Parents paused their conversations, joggers slowed their pace, and children stopped mid-play to watch the officers near the oak tree. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the shiny metal of playground equipment, painting an odd juxtaposition of law enforcement against childhood innocence. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the two officers, Officer Kim and Officer Jones, approach Sarah Whitfield. He felt exposed, his earlier confidence draining away. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe this was a bad idea. But the hat, it had to mean something, didn't it? Something dangerous. From his position near the duck pond, Ethan strained to listen as the officers stopped in front of the woman. They greeted her with a surprising amount of respect, their voices low and deferential. That was when Ethan noticed the shift. The way Officer Kim's posture relaxed slightly, and the almost imperceptible glance between her and Sarah. He couldn't hear their exact words, but it became clear. They knew her. "Afternoon, Chief," Officer Kim had said. The realization hit Ethan like a slap. "Chief? Chief of what?" His stomach churned as Sarah stood, her book still tucked under her arm, and turned her attention toward him. The ease with which she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her steps, it suddenly made sense. The truth was now undeniable. The woman in the red MAGA hat, the one he had assumed was some kind of agitator, was in fact the police chief of his town. Amasinsure Ethan stood frozen, unsure whether to run or face whatever was coming. Before he could decide, Sarah began walking toward him. The officers stayed back, letting her handle the situation on her own. Her calm demeanor was disarming, and as she approached, Ethan's guilt and embarrassment grew unbearable. "I'm Sarah Whitfield," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. She extended her hand, a small smile softening her otherwise sharp features. "And you must be Ethan Reynolds." Her words carried no accusation, but the weight of his actions pressed down on him all the same. Slowly, he reached out to shake her hand. I didn't know," he stammered. "I gathered that," she replied, her tone almost light. Then she tilted her head, studying him. "I'd like to hear your side of things. What made you call the police on me?" Ethan's mouth went dry. How could he explain it without sounding like a fool? I, I saw the hat, he began, faltering. And I thought, well, it just didn't feel right. You sitting there, wearing that, in this town. Her gaze remained steady, giving him no indication of anger, only curiosity. So the hat made you uncomfortable? He nodded, his face burning. It's not just the hat. It's what it stands for. It's the people I've seen wearing it, the things they say. I thought you might, I don't know, I thought you might cause trouble. For a moment she said nothing, letting his words hang in the air. Then she gestured toward a nearby bench. How about we sit and talk? And they sat side by side on the park bench, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the path. Ethan kept his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his foot tapping nervously against the gravel. Sarah, by contrast, leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but attentive. You know, she began, her voice even, when I first became chief of police, one of the first things I had to get used to was people making assumptions about me. Some folks thought I was too young, too inexperienced, or that I'd only gotten the job because of politics. Others assumed, because I'm a woman, I couldn't handle the pressure. She glanced at him, her eyes softening. I've had people make all kinds of snap judgments about me, some of them harmless, some of them dangerous. Ethan swallowed hard, her words hitting closer to home than he liked. She continued, This hat, she said, touching the brim of the red MAGA cap, was a gift from my father. He passed away a few years ago. He loved this country more than anything and believed in hard work and community. To him, the hat was a reminder of those values. It's not about politics for me. It's about remembering him. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He'd assumed the hat meant one thing, carried one message, but now it was something entirely different, something personal, something human. I didn't know, he said quietly. That's the thing about assumptions, Ethan, she replied. We don't know, we just decide. Her words lingered between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan wanted to explain himself, to defend his actions, but no words came. What defense could he offer? He judged her without knowing a single thing about her. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, as if she'd been expecting that. Apology accepted. But here's the thing, this isn't just about me. It's about what happens next time you see someone who makes you uncomfortable. What will you do then? Ethan looked away, his chest tightening. He didn't have an answer. And the officers had left by the time their conversation ended, and the park had begun to settle back into its usual rhythm. Parents called to their children, joggers resumed their pace, and the golden light of the setting sun bathed the world in a warm glow. As Ethan watched Sarah walk back to her bench, he felt a strange mix of shame and gratitude. Shame for what he'd done, and gratitude for the way she'd handled it, with patience and grace, when she had every right to be angry. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of a question that had long been buried beneath his biases and routines. What else have I been wrong about? The bell over the diner door jingled as Ethan stepped inside, the sound startling him even though he'd expected it. The warmth of the place hit him immediately. The hum of conversation, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, and the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with syrupy sweetness. The walls were adorned with photos of the town's history, black and white shots of parades, festivals, and sports teams that marked the passage of decades. It was a nostalgic slice of Americana, but Ethan barely noticed. His nerves drowned out everything else. In a booth near the window, Sarah Whitfield sat waiting, a mug of coffee in her hands. She wasn't in uniform today, just a navy sweater and jeans, but there was still something commanding about her presence. Her red MAGA hat was nowhere to be seen. Instead, her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked up as he approached, a small, polite smile softening her face. You came, she said, motioning for him to sit. Ethan nodded stiffly, sliding into the booth across from her. I wasn't sure if I should, he admitted, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Why not? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was calm, inviting, but there was a trace of curiosity in her tone. He hesitated. I guess I thought you might not want to talk to me. After everything. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. Ethan, if I didn't want to talk, I wouldn't have invited you here. I don't hold grudges, but I do believe in conversations, especially the hard ones. Her words were steady, without judgment, but they carried weight. Ethan nodded again, unsure how to respond. A waitress appeared, setting a menu in front of him and refilling Sarah's coffee. What can I get you, hon? The waitress asked, her voice warm. Just coffee, Ethan replied quickly. He wasn't hungry, not with the knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. When the waitress left, Sarah leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. So, Ethan, let's get right to it. Why did you call the police on me? Ethan flinched at her bluntness, but appreciated that she didn't dance around the issue. I don't know. I saw the hat, and I assumed the worst. He looked down at his hands, ashamed. It felt like it meant something dangerous. Like you might be trouble, and I reacted, Sarah finished for him. He nodded. Yeah, reacted. Sarah leaned back, considering him. You know, I could sit here and tell you how wrong you were, but something tells me you already know that. Ethan glanced up, meeting her gaze. I do, he admitted. I can't stop thinking about it, about how unfair it was, how I didn't even give you a chance. I'm sorry. The apology was genuine, and Sarah seemed to recognize it. She nodded slowly, letting a moment of silence pass between them. Apology accepted, she said finally, but I'm more interested in understanding what led you to that moment. Why the hat? Why me? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. It's hard to explain. I've just seen so much hate associated with that symbol. The shouting matches, the violence, the division. It's like a warning sign to me now, you know? And when I saw you sitting there, I jumped to conclusions. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, taking another sip of her coffee. I get that, she said. Symbols are powerful. They carry meanings that go far beyond what they were intended for, and depending on your experiences, those meanings can vary a lot. Ethan frowned. But why wear it? You don't seem like, well, the kind of person I thought you were. Sarah smirked slightly. The kind of person you thought I was, she repeated. That's fair. To you, the hat means conflict, but to me, it's just a reminder of my dad. She paused, her expression softening. He was a mechanic, ran a little garage out in the country. He didn't care much for politics, but he loved this country. Worked his whole life to build something from nothing. When that slogan came around, it resonated with him. Not because of politics, but because he believed in the idea of people working hard to make things better. When he died, I kept the hat because it reminded me of him, not because I subscribed to everything it's been tied to. Ethan listened, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. He hadn't expected this perspective, hadn't considered that the hat could mean something different to someone else. That must have been tough, he said quietly. Sarah shrugged, a trace of sadness flickering across her face. Losing him was, but the assumptions people make because of the hat? That's just part of life now. She leaned forward again, her tone firm but kind. But you know what I've learned? You can't let other people's actions define your identity. You choose who you are, Ethan, and you choose how you treat others. That's the only thing that matters. Her words hit him hard, cutting through the layers of defensiveness he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For years, Ethan had clung to his beliefs, his assumptions, as a way of making sense of a chaotic world. But now, faced with Sarah's calm honesty, He saw how limiting that mindset had become. "I don't want to be the kind of person who judges people like that," he said, his voice low. "I don't want to make people feel small or misunderstood, but I don't know how to change." Sarah smiled faintly. "Change isn't a light switch, Ethan. It's a process. It starts with moments like this, when you choose to listen instead of react." Ethan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He still felt the weight of his mistakes, but for the first time, he also felt a glimmer of hope. The waitress returned with his coffee, and he took a cautious sip, the warmth spreading through him. Across the table, Sarah sat quietly, giving him the space to reflect. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, town events, shared memories of the park, Ethan realized something surprising. He was enjoying her company. The tension that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of connection. When they parted ways an hour later, Ethan felt like he'd taken the first step toward something better. He didn't know what that better looked like yet, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to find out. The house was quiet when Ethan Reynolds returned home that evening. Too quiet. The faint creak of the floorboards under his feet echoed in the stillness, a reminder of how empty his life had become. He shrugged off his jacket, letting it fall over the back of a chair, and sank into the worn recliner in the living room. The house reflected his life. Tidy, but uninspired. The furniture was practical and plain, the walls a neutral beige, adorned with a few framed photos of better days. One in particular caught his eye, a photo of him and his daughter Jenna, taken years ago. She was grinning wide, a diploma in her hands, her cap slightly askew. Jenna, her voice lingered in his mind, an echo of the last argument they'd had. "You're so stuck in your ways, Dad. You don't even try to see the world from anyone else's perspective." The fight had been months ago, and they hadn't spoken much since. Jenna lived in a different city now, and though she'd offered countless olive branches, inviting him for dinner, suggesting phone calls, Ethan had always found a reason to decline. Too busy, too tired, maybe later. In truth, it wasn't busyness that held him back. It was fear. Fear of hearing that same criticism again. Fear of realizing she might be right. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a broken record. The park, the call, Sarah Whitfield's steady gaze as she dismantled his assumptions with grace. He felt embarrassed, not just for his actions, but for how deeply ingrained his snap judgments had become. The conversation at the diner had stirred something in him, a question he couldn't ignore. What else have I been wrong about? He reached for the remote, hoping to drown out his thoughts with the television. But as he flipped through the channels, nothing could hold his attention. Everything felt hollow, like noise against the backdrop of his swirling emotions. Finally, he gave in. He picked up his phone from the coffee table, stared at Jenna's number, and hesitated. "What am I even going to say?" he muttered to himself. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he couldn't press it. Instead, he scrolled through their text history, stopping at her last message. "I miss you, Dad. Call me when you're ready." It had been weeks since she'd sent it, and he hadn't responded. The phone slipped from his hand as guilt washed over him. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his temples. Why is this so hard? The next morning, Ethan awoke to a house bathed in pale sunlight. He shuffled to the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood by the window, looking out at his quiet street. The neighborhood was waking up, mailboxes opening and shutting, cars pulling out of driveways. His mind wandered back to Sarah. Her words had stuck with him, especially the part about change being a process. He didn't know if he could change, but he knew he couldn't stay the same. Not after yesterday. Later that afternoon, he found himself back at the park. He hadn't planned to go, but something about the place drew him in. The familiar sounds greeted him, the laughter of children, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog. He spotted Sarah near the community board, pinning up a flyer. He hesitated. Should he approach her? What if she didn't want to see him again? Before he could decide, Sarah turned and spotted him. Her face lit up with a polite smile, and she gestured for him to come over. "Ethan," she said warmly, "good to see you again. How are you?" "Better, I think," he replied, scratching the back of his neck. "I've been thinking about what you said. A lot." Sarah folded her arms, her expression encouraging. "That's good. Reflection is the first step." Ethan nodded, feeling the conversation start to flow more easily than he expected. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the flyer she'd just posted. "A community project," Sarah said. "We're organizing a cleanup day for the park and the surrounding neighborhood. It's a way to bring people together and make a difference. You should come." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the invitation. "Me? I don't know if I'd be much help." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "Everyone can help, Ethan. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up." He hesitated, her words echoing in his mind. "It's about showing up." "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask," Sarah replied, her tone warm but firm. They drank on Bundry that evening. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the flyer Sarah had handed him. He wasn't sure why he'd taken it, but now that it was in his hands, he couldn't stop looking at it. The idea of joining the cleanup made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being part of something like that, especially with people he didn't know. But he also couldn't shake the memory of Sarah's steady gaze, the quiet challenge in her words. Everyone can help. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a desire to try. He picked up his phone, scrolling to Jenna's number again. This time, he pressed the call button before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Dad?" Her voice was cautious, but there was a warmth in it that made his chest tighten. "Hey, Jenna," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I was wondering if you're free to grab dinner sometime. I'd really like to catch up." There was a pause on the other end, and Ethan held his breath. "Yeah," Jenna said softly. "I'd like that." As they made plans, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Trois Croix de Calme the next morning, he called the number on Sarah's flyer. "I'd like to sign up for the cleanup," he said when a cheerful volunteer answered. "That's great. We're so glad to have you," the volunteer replied. As Ethan hung up the phone, he felt a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to find out. Saturday morning arrived with a chill in the air and a pale blue sky stretching endlessly above the park. Ethan pulled into the parking lot, his heart racing. He clutched the steering wheel, staring at the growing crowd gathered near the pavilion. There were at least 30 people, most of them chatting in small groups, some unloading tools from the backs of trucks. Bright posters on easels displayed instructions for the day's cleanup effort. Ethan glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was tense, his hair slightly disheveled, and he looked every bit as unsure as he felt. "What am I even doing here?" Before he could talk himself out of it, a light knock on his window startled him. He turned to see Sarah Whitfield smiling at him through the glass. She wore a windbreaker over a sweatshirt and a ball cap, not the infamous red one, but a plain navy blue one with the town's logo embroidered on the front. Ethan rolled down the window. "Morning, Ethan," Sarah said cheerfully. "You planning to join us or just watching from the safety of your car?" He chuckled nervously, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'm coming. Just gearing up." "Well, you've got good timing. We're about to split into teams," she said, stepping back as he climbed out of the car. "Glad you made it." Her words were simple, but they carried an unexpected warmth that settled his nerves just a little. Duger Yunzer. Under the pavilion, volunteers gathered in a semicircle around Sarah as she went over the plan. Each team was assigned a specific area of the park or surrounding neighborhood, with tools, gloves, and trash bags provided. Ethan found himself paired with a small group tasked with clearing out an overgrown section of the park near the creek. Among his teammates were a young couple named Marcus and Elena, and an older man named Walter, who had the easy confidence of someone who had been part of the community for decades. "Nice to meet you," Marcus said, shaking Ethan's hand. "First time volunteering?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, guess I'm a rookie at this." Marcus grinned. "Don't worry. Just watch out for Walter. He'll have you running laps by noon." Walter chuckled, hefting a pair of clippers. "I don't need laps. I need strong backs. Let's get to it." Ethan smiled, his nerves easing as the group began their work. The overgrown creek bed was a mess of tangled branches, litter, and stubborn weeds. It was hard work, but the shared effort brought a surprising camaraderie. Marcus and Elena worked quickly, chatting as they went, while Walter offered tips on the best way to tackle the stubborn brush. Ethan mostly kept to himself at first, focusing on clearing a section of brambles. But as the morning went on, he found himself drawn into the group's conversations. "Watch your footing near that slope," Walter said, pointing to a patch of loose soil. "I've seen more than one ankle go bad out here." Ethan nodded, carefully stepping around the area. "You've done this before, huh?" "Every year," Walter replied, straightening up. "Been coming to this park since I was a kid. Feels good to give back." Ethan paused, looking around at the creek. The sunlight glinted off the water, the air filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt connected to something bigger than himself. "It does," he said quietly, surprising himself. "As the team worked, a voice called out from nearby. "Hey, can I get a hand?" Ethan turned to see a woman struggling to lift a heavy trash bag into the back of a pickup truck. Without thinking, he dropped his clippers and jogged over. "Here, let me help," he said, grabbing the other side of the bag. Together, they heaved it into the truck bed with a satisfying thud. "Thanks," the woman said, brushing her hands on her jeans. "I was about to lose that fight." "No problem," Ethan replied, offering a small smile. She extended a hand. "I'm Maria. You're with Sarah's group, right?" "Yeah, first time doing this," he admitted. "Well, welcome. It's nice to see new faces," Maria said warmly. "Keep it up. We've got plenty more bags where that came from." As she walked away, Ethan felt a flicker of pride. It was a small gesture, but it felt good to be useful, to be part of something. By midday, the group took a break, gathering near the pavilion for sandwiches and coffee provided by local businesses. Ethan sat on the edge of a picnic table, listening as Marcus and Elena joked about their clumsy attempts at clearing weeds. Walter chimed in with stories of past cleanup events, his voice booming with laughter. "You're quiet, Ethan," Marcus said, nudging him playfully. "What's your story?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Not much to tell," he said finally. "Just trying to figure some things out." Marcus nodded, his tone growing more serious. "Aren't we all?" The simplicity of the statement struck Ethan. Here was a man he'd never met before, someone from a completely different walk of life, and yet they shared this common thread of searching, of trying to find their way. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't entirely alone. Bonso. As the day wound down and the creek bed looked noticeably cleaner, Sarah stopped by their group to check in. "How's it going?" she asked, hands on her hips as she surveyed the area. "Looking good," Walter said, gesturing to the cleared section. "This guy's a natural," he added, nodding toward Ethan. Ethan flushed slightly. "Just following orders." Sarah smiled. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. And thanks for being here, Ethan. It means a lot." Her words lingered long after she walked away. By the time the event wrapped up, Ethan was exhausted but strangely invigorated. As he loaded the last of the tools into the back of a truck, he looked around at the park. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, but it was better than it had been that morning. And so was he. As he drove home that evening, his muscles aching and his clothes streaked with dirt, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The morning after the cleanup event, Ethan woke with a slight ache in his back and arms, a reminder of the physical labor he hadn't done in years. But there was something else too, a sense of satisfaction that lingered as he poured his coffee and looked out the kitchen window. The park had been transformed, at least in part, and Ethan felt like he had been transformed too. The strangers he'd worked alongside, Marcus, Elena, Walter, even Maria, had treated him like one of their own. They hadn't cared about his background, his politics, or his mistakes. They'd simply welcomed him. Ethan's thoughts drifted to Jenna. He'd spoken to her briefly before the cleanup, but their conversation had been cautious, like walking on thin ice. He knew he couldn't repair their relationship overnight, but maybe now he had the courage to try. With his coffee in hand, Ethan sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He'd never been one for long emails, but this morning he felt the need to write. The subject, thinking of you. Hi Jenna, I just wanted to say how much it meant to me to hear your voice the other day. I know I haven't been the best at keeping in touch, and I want to change that. Yesterday, I volunteered at a park cleanup event. It wasn't something I would have done before, but it reminded me how much I've been missing out on by staying in my own little bubble. I thought about you while I was there, about the things you've said to me in the past, how I need to open my mind and stop jumping to conclusions. You were right, and I'm sorry it's taken me so long to see that. I hope we can meet soon. I'd really like to hear about what's going on in your life. Love. Dad. Ethan hesitated before pressing send, his finger hovering over the trackpad. He reread the message, wondering if it was too much or not enough. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about finding the perfect words. It was about taking the first step. He clicked send and leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself back at the park, drawn there by an impulse he couldn't quite explain. The section of the creek his group had worked on looked even better in the daylight. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the air smelled clean and fresh. As he walked along the path, he noticed Sarah Whitfield standing near a group of children. They were huddled around a small table, painting wooden birdhouses under her supervision. Ethan approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt. Sarah looked up and waved him over. "Ethan," she said, smiling. "Fancy seeing you here." "I guess I couldn't stay away," he said, chuckling. "What's going on here?" "Birdhouse project," Sarah explained. "We're setting up nesting boxes around the park to encourage wildlife. The kids love it, and it's a good way to teach them about taking care of their environment." Ethan watched as a young boy proudly held up a brightly painted birdhouse. The pure joy on his face was infectious, and Ethan found himself smiling despite himself. "You know," Sarah said, lowering her voice, "there's always room for more volunteers." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know anything about birdhouses." Sarah grinned. "Neither did I until about an hour ago. That's the beauty of it. You learn as you go." Ethan spent the next hour helping the kids with their birdhouses. He wasn't particularly skilled at painting, but the children didn't seem to mind. One little girl, no older than 7, handed him a brush and asked him to paint a sun on the side of her birdhouse. "Not bad," she said approvingly when he finished, her tone serious, as if she were judging a professional artist's work. "Thanks," Ethan replied, smiling. "You've got a good eye for design." As the project wrapped up, Ethan felt a strange sense of pride. It wasn't about the birdhouses. It was about being part of something meaningful, something that brought people together. That evening, as Ethan sat in his living room, his phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw a notification, an email from Jenna. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "Hi, Dad. Thanks for your email. It means a lot to hear you say that. I've always wanted us to have a closer relationship, and I'm glad you're taking steps to make that happen. I'd love to meet up soon. Let's do dinner next week. I can drive up, or we can meet halfway. I'm proud of you for volunteering at the park. It sounds like a great experience, and I hope it's just the beginning of many more like it. Love, Jenna." Ethan reread the email several times, a warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the verge of reconnecting with his daughter. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning how to bridge the gaps in his life, one small act of kindness at a time. The community cleanup had been the catalyst, but it was the smaller moments afterward that cemented the changes in Ethan Reynolds' life. A week after the event, he found himself at a bustling community meeting, seated at a long table in the local recreation center. The room buzzed with energy, people discussing ideas for improving the town, raising money for park renovations, and organizing future volunteer events. Ethan wasn't entirely comfortable yet. He still felt like an outsider, a novice stepping into a world where everyone else seemed to know what they were doing. But he was here, and that counted for something. Seated next to him was Sarah Whitfield, her presence steady and reassuring. She glanced over and gave him an encouraging smile. "You doing okay?" "Yeah," he said, adjusting the notepad in front of him. "Just taking it all in." She chuckled. "That's the best place to start." The meeting ended with an assignment. Ethan's group was tasked with organizing a neighborhood food drive. It felt daunting at first. He had no idea how to coordinate such a thing, but Marcus and Elena, his teammates from the cleanup, quickly stepped in to offer guidance. "Start small," Elena said, as they gathered outside the rec center. "Pick a few local businesses to partner with, set up drop-off points, and get the word out." Marcus nodded. "And don't be afraid to ask for help. People want to pitch in. They just need to be asked." Ethan appreciated their advice, but he couldn't shake the fear of messing it up. What if no one donates? What if we don't collect enough food? What if I let everyone down? Sarah must have noticed the worry on his face because she pulled him aside as the group dispersed. "You're going to do fine," she said. "Just focus on the goal, helping people. The rest will work itself out." Her confidence in him was both humbling and motivating. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ethan spent his evenings visiting local businesses, explaining the food drive and asking for their support. To his surprise, most of them were enthusiastic about the idea. The local grocery store agreed to set up a donation bin near the entrance, and a small cafe offered to host a collection point as well. Word spread quickly, thanks in part to Maria, who helped design colorful flyers and posted them all over town. Ethan found himself making phone calls, coordinating schedules, and even speaking at a town council meeting to promote the event. For someone who had spent years keeping to himself, it was a startling transformation. The day of the food drive arrived, and Ethan was at the park early, setting up tables and sorting supplies. Volunteers trickled in throughout the morning, including Marcus, Elena, Walter, and Maria. By noon, the park was buzzing with activity as families, students, and retirees dropped off bags of canned goods and non-perishable items. Ethan worked tirelessly, unloading donations from cars, organizing items into categories, and thanking every person who contributed. Each thank you felt like a small step forward, a way to repay the kindness he had been shown. At one point, a woman with 2 small children approached, holding a bag of groceries. It's not much, she said hesitantly, but I wanted to help. Ethan smiled warmly. Every little bit makes a difference. Thank you. As she walked away, he felt a pang of emotion. It was a simple moment, but it encapsulated everything he had come to understand about community. The power of small actions to create something larger than oneself. Bisou. By late afternoon, the collection bins were overflowing. Ethan stood back, surveying the scene with a mixture of pride and disbelief. They had surpassed their goal, collecting enough food to stock the shelves of the local food pantry for months. Sarah approached, a clipboard in hand, and a satisfied expression on her face. "Looks like a success to me," she said. Ethan nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "I didn't think we could pull it off." "You didn't just pull it off, you led the charge," she said. "And you made a real difference." For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He thought back to the man he had been just a few months ago, isolated, judgmental, and stuck in his ways. That man felt like a stranger now. "It wasn't just me," he said finally. "It was all of us." Sarah smiled, her eyes gleaming with approval. "Exactly." That evening, Ethan returned home exhausted, but exhilarated. As he sat at his kitchen table, a familiar notification lit up his phone. A text from Jenna. Jenna. "Hey, Dad. Just wanted to let you know I'm so proud of you. Can't wait to hear all about the food drive when we meet for dinner this weekend. Love you." Ethan read the message twice, his heart swelling with gratitude. He thought back to all the small choices that had led him here. The call to Jenna, the cleanup event, the decision to keep showing up even when it felt uncomfortable. He realized that Sarah had been right. Change wasn't a light switch. It was a series of moments, each one building on the last, until the weight of the old ways no longer held him down. He picked up his phone and typed a quick reply. "Ethan. Thanks, Jenna. Looking forward to it. Love you too." As he hit send, he leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of peace settling over him. The road ahead wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The park, once a palette of winter browns and grays, now burst with life. Fresh green shoots lined the pathways, cherry blossoms fluttered in the breeze, and the air carried a faint, sweet scent of blooming flowers. Ethan Reynolds walked along the familiar trail toward the oak tree, where the cleanup effort had begun months ago. The memory of that day felt distant, almost like a story that had happened to someone else. In many ways, it had. Under the oak tree, Sarah Whitfield sat on the same stone bench where Ethan had first seen her. She wasn't reading today. Instead, she watched the world around her with a quiet contentment. Her ball cap shielded her face from the sun, and a steaming cup of coffee sat on the bench beside her. Ethan approached, his steps light but purposeful. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty spot on the bench. Sarah looked up and smiled. "Of course." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the park filling the space between them, a dog barking, the crunch of gravel under a jogger's feet, the faint laughter of children on the playground. "How's Jenna?" Sarah asked finally. Ethan smiled, the mention of his daughter warming him. "She's good. We had dinner last weekend. It was different, in a good way." He paused, his voice softening. "She told me she's proud of me." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting genuine pride. "That's a big step." "It is," Ethan said. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear it until she said it. I think we're finally starting to rebuild what we lost." "That's the thing about bridges," Sarah said thoughtfully. "They take time to construct, but once they're up, they can carry a lot of weight." Ethan chuckled. "You've always got a metaphor ready, don't you?" Sarah grinned. "Occupational hazard." As they sat together, Ethan reflected on how much had changed since the day he'd made that 911 call. He still felt a twinge of shame when he thought about it, but Sarah had never held it against him. Instead, she'd turned it into an opportunity to teach him, to show him a better way. "I've been meaning to ask," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Why didn't you call me out that day in the park? You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone. Honestly, I would have deserved it." Sarah tilted her head, considering his question. "Because that wouldn't have helped either of us. People don't change when they're cornered. They dig in. But if you meet them where they are, show them another way, they just might surprise you." Ethan nodded, letting her words sink in. "Well, it worked. You changed my life, Sarah." Her smile softened. "No, Ethan, you changed your life. I just gave you a little push." The conversation turned to the park itself, now brimming with activity. The birdhouses the children had painted were nestled in trees, and the creek bed was clear and vibrant. A new community garden had taken root in a sunny corner of the park, tended by volunteers who had come together after the cleanup event. "It's amazing how much this place has transformed," Ethan said. "It's amazing how much you've transformed," Sarah replied. He shook his head. "Still a work in progress." "Aren't we all?" she said, her tone light but meaningful. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan felt a quiet resolve growing within him. The small steps he'd taken, reaching out to Jenna, volunteering, learning to listen, had set him on a new path. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he no longer feared them. Before they parted ways, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Ethan with a smile. "What's this?" he asked, unfolding it. "A flyer for our next project," she said. "We're organizing a mentorship program for at-risk youth in the community. I think you'd be perfect for it." Ethan's initial reaction was hesitation, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of possibility. He'd been hesitant before, about the cleanup, the food drive, even meeting Jenna, but each time he'd found something worthwhile on the other side. "I'll think about it," he said, echoing the words he'd used months ago. Sarah gave him a knowing look. "That's all I ask." As Ethan walked away from the park, he felt the warmth of the sun on his back and the steady rhythm of his steps on the path. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of where it might lead. He thought about the people he'd met: Sarah, Marcus, Elena, Walter, and Maria, and the ways they had shown him what community could mean. He thought about Jenna and the bridge they were rebuilding, one conversation at a time. Most of all, he thought about the lesson he'd learned, that kindness and understanding could transform not only the world around him, but also the world within him. Wanjertasadadi Epilogue, A New Beginning. Months later, Ethan stood on the same park bench where Sarah had once sat, addressing a small group of volunteers at the mentorship program's kickoff event. His voice was steady, his words heartfelt, as he shared his journey of change and the lessons he had learned. As he spoke, he saw Jenna in the crowd, her eyes shining with pride. Sarah stood beside her, nodding in quiet encouragement. For the first time, Ethan felt like he belonged, not just to this community, but to the world at large. The message he left them with was simple but powerful. Kindness can change everything, if you let it.